Thank you very much. I've already, while having coffee, learned a fair amount about issues that are on the forefront on social protection and nutrition in India. So I look forward to this full day of discussions on the topic. The first question you're going to want to address, oops, how does this go up? It's not responding.
Yeah, that's it. Just go down.
Okay, right, okay. I was pressing a different button. Question is, why do we care about adding nutrition to social protection programs? Their first and foremost goal is to address equity, to address poverty. And the reason is in part because the toolkits we have to address nutrition are very broad. The 2013 Lancet review of the best evidence-based programs on nutrition-specific interventions. It said, if you can take the 10 programs that we know most about, scale it up to cover 90% of the malnourished children in the world, you would reduce stunting by only 20%. That's appreciable, and it's appreciated, but it's not anybody's goal, I don't believe, to reduce stunting by only 20%. It doesn't fit in with the SDGs. So there's a need to find programs that complement these nutrition-specific interventions, and there are a number of nutrition-sensitive interventions: agriculture, social protection, education, a range of them. Why they can be important? Well, first of all, one of the most obvious reasons is they cover a lot of people. Over the last few years, countries have recognized that social protection programs are not just a luxury that the Danes can give to their population or well-off countries can do, that it can be done in low-income countries on well-designed programs. And, of course, by its very nature, social protection reaches the people that are most vulnerable to undernutrition. It reaches the poor, and there have been a great deal of progress on how to deliver, how to find the poor and get programs to them. This and over the last decade or two, major improvements. These type of programs not only reach the target population we want, including women who can get empowered by being recipients of social protection, and that in itself has an impact on nutrition. But these can be platforms. If you deliver transfer programs to the low-income population, you can use that as a platform to add nutrition-specific interventions. Finally, by having nutrition as tied to a social protection program, you can make it clear that there's not a trade-off between equity and efficiency, between reaching the poor and investing in growth. They're the same programs, or they can be. They can be tied so that reaching the poor is part of a growth strategy. Just to show you an example, this is taken from national budgets. The growth on investment in social protection over the recent years is extraordinary. So it gives the potential right there for, if you can make the programs nutrition sensitive, you have a great deal of program to work with. Just wanted to mention, although I've been talking social protection, I really mean safety nets. Safety nets is a subset of social protection. Social protection includes social insurance, like unemployment insurance. It includes pensions. It includes child care, child protection services, services to eliminate child trafficking. I'm talking about a subset. social protection, safety net is a subset of social protection, and social protection itself is a subset of policies both for growth, equity, and poverty reduction. So I just want to make that, clarify the target discussion is on safety nets, which is only a subset of a much larger system of social protection. I also say that safety nets are part of life cycle. There are programs in many countries, if they have a system of social protection, safety nets are designed for different needs at different times in the life cycle. I'll mention this now just briefly, but one point that I think should be considered: many countries do not have the resources to address each area in the life cycle with as much as they would want to. And they are trade-offs that have to be decided upon, policy decisions on how much you want to put in different type of programs, some of which are nutrition sensitive and some of which are not, but nevertheless address equity. There are, as in most things, as economists know, there are trade-offs to be considered. So the basic mechanisms that underlie how a safety net can affect nutrition: clearly, one, it increases resources to the households. I guess most people here are economists, or at least familiar with economics. It's moving along an angled curve. It's moving along without any change of behavior. Just having more resources means you can control more goods and services. In addition, safety nets will sometimes reduce the price of food, and sometimes will reduce the cost of obtaining services. A conditional cash transfer, in effect, reduces the cost of health care because it makes it a negative price rather than a positive price. But more than that, there is evidence, and I'll go back to that, evidence that being a recipient to a safety net program often actually changes preferences, even when it's not an intrinsic feature of the program. But in some cases, it can put design features that are intrinsic, that have included behavior change communication to improve, to increase the nutritional impacts. Finally, a safety net program, when it's in kind, and there are some still, I'll get to that later, can be a vehicle for micronutrient substitution. And often, if a household is indifferent, because for taste reasons, between a fortified product and a non-fortified product, providing that fortified product will be a clear net addition to the micronutrient consumption. Just to say, just the general pattern, where does income growth, which of course safety nets are part of at the household level, contribute to reduction in malnutrition? This is from estimates that I published in the Lancet. At the time, I estimated, and I did this 10 years earlier and repeated with later data, came up roughly the same number. A 10% increase in GNP would lead to a 6% reduction in stunting. Turns out I think those numbers are wrong. I'm putting them up here anyhow just to start the discussion, because I think the numbers are smaller. I think it's probably closer to a 3%. The difference is long run and short run. I was dealing with a long run response. A short run response would be less. But when I thought it was 6%, I said, that's evidence that you are not going to grow out of malnutrition in a generation. No matter what type of income growth you have, it's going to take longer. For most countries. Clearly, if you can maintain double-digit growth for a long time, that's a different story, but very few countries do. When it's actually a lower elasticity, then it's even going to take longer just by relying on income growth alone. And there's a dual problem. Income growth not only leads to reduced stunting, it leads to increased obesity. And that's getting to be a problem, dual burden of malnutrition. You may have heard that concept. And it's a problem in randomized controlled trials of safety nets have shown progress in reducing stunting and increase of obesity. And again goes to the point that it's not just what you do with income, the messages and the features you put on it, the design elements, are important to maximize its impact. Just again to say, I gave you the graphs I showed were based on GNP growth. But I've done the same type of analysis as household levels, and you get roughly the same response. As incomes at the household level go up, malnutrition does decline, but at a relatively slow rate. And that's in part because as you get more income, doesn't allow you to buy health services at the village very easily. It doesn't allow you, a 10% increase of income is not going to give you a sanitation system by itself. That's why it's a long-run process without other investments. Calculations I've done using data from India, but I've done this with data in other countries as well. It's a universal problem. If you were to move the two lowest quintiles to have the attributes, the assets and education of the middle quintile in India, malnutrition rates, I'm using data that's now about 5 years old. Fortunately, things have improved. Malnutrition rates would drop from 48% to 39%. Still would be one of the highest in the world. But if you gave the two lowest quintiles the assets of the middle quintile, you'd eliminate poverty. So you'd eliminate income poverty and still have health poverty in the absence of programs. So I mention this not only for the motivation of why you need both nutrition-sensitive and nutrition-specific interventions, but also to say income growth, including transfers, but growth of wages as well, is only part. It is a part, but only one part of a complicated path to improve nutrition. Now, it turns out, and this is intriguing, there's a lot of evidence, safety nets do change people's preferences. Clearly, as their income increases, they're going to buy more food. This is a standard. It's been shown for 150 years since the first angle curve was made. Usually increase half of the additional resources at least goes towards food for a low-income household. Not just quantity, but quality. Some of that quality is just better taste, but some of that quality improvement is diet diversity. And the nutritionists that are here will know that diet diversity is probably as or more important than increasing calories in most places. I should also mention, because a transfer program, some people say, well, if you transfer income to households, they're going to work less. That evidence that people sometimes cite have to do with the type of programs like unemployment insurance, which may give you 80% of your previous income. That may be a disincentive to re-enter the labor market. The transfer programs that we're considering from social protection, we're talking about, are 10, 20%, 25% of household income. There's very little, if any, evidence that it leads to dropping out of the labor force. The strongest evidence is that it may lead to change from formal to informal sector if there's a means test, but it doesn't change labor. And it may mean the labor that is most responsive to an income transfer is child labor. And I don't think anyone's going to argue that a reduction of child labor is out of keeping with our goals in a transfer program. So anyhow, beneficiaries also, I should say, of transfer programs, the second common anecdote that goes out is that people will spend out of their transfer programs towards alcohol or tobacco. And there will always be an anecdote. Every village has got its drunk. However, there is no evidence. A study of 19 countries shows that there's no evidence of spending more on alcohol because you're a recipient of a transfer program. Doesn't mean you're going to stop drinking if you already were, but there's no evidence that it encourages drinking. But more important, there's something called nutrition labeling. That is, there is a tendency to spend more out of transfer programs on food than you do out of other income. And the evidence for that is extensive. The evidence comes from, even if the program has no explicit condition, it's not a conditional transfer, it's perceived merely the government is doing this for a reason. And countries then, recipients then say, they want us to buy more food. And this is, even if it's not a communication campaign. This has been shown in many countries. Colombia, Ecuador, Mexico, Nicaragua. I've seen evidence from India as well. Even the United States with the food stamps. That pattern has been shown repeatedly. Why it happens is a mixture. It's hard to show. Part of it is probably social marketing. People perceive that this is why we're getting the transfer. We might lose the transfer if we don't buy more food. Even though it's not explicit, not a rule, people tend to second guess. But the other reason, which has been shown, and there is evidence on that, many transfer programs, and this could be a design feature of a transfer program, give the resources to women. And there is plenty of global evidence that when women control budgets, they spend more on food and health than men do on average. Now, there's not a lot of experimental evidence from a transfer program giving for half the recipients to men and half to women to show this. But there has been research that have tried to tease out the common phenomena that recipients of transfer income spend differently out of that income than they do out of general income. But we're talking about spending more on food, spending somewhat more in education, and spending somewhat more on purchasing health services or going to health clinics. What's the result? And this is a big one. What's the result on nutritional status? Turns out less than would be desired. Meta-analyses, both of conditional and unconditional, show very little impact on reduction of stunting. This is clearly worrisome. Gets to the fact of we better understand this so we can design better programs, because these programs have as an objective in many cases to reduce stunting. Part of the reason is the income that the households receive, as I've mentioned before, cannot address the sanitation problems, cannot guarantee a quality health service. And the income alone doesn't change knowledge about child care. And the standard model, heuristic, it's simplified, but nutrition is a product both of food security, child care, and health and sanitation. Changing food security is relatively easy, relatively speaking. Changing health and sanitation, changing child care doesn't come automatic. Evidence that this is on the first few CCTs that were done in Latin America shows improved use of health services, particularly growth monitoring. Now, I'm going to get to that in a second, and some reduction of stunting. But when you go to the meta-analysis, and this is a meta from 17 countries, you'll see at the very bottom of this, I don't have a laser pointer, this is the average, 0. not statistically different on average when you pool everything. Now, it's not all that bad. There's some heterogeneity. I'll get to that. But clearly, a little bit disappointing, I'm afraid. Okay, so let's get to the glass half full part of the story. Now, I should mention part of the reason for this are research issues. Most of the countries in this are Latin America, where malnutrition rates are less to start with, and maybe less to do with poverty, because the programs are designed primarily as a poverty program. Part of the issue is that these studies try to look at changes of malnutrition, usually children under 5. However, children under 2 are much more malleable. If you do your analysis on children under 5, it's like a moving average. It moves slower. If you break your analysis and look at only the under 2s, you often see a different impact, a bigger impact. But that's not the studies that were pooled in this meta-analysis. Finally, and again, in case somebody like 3IE wants to fund any randomized controlled trials, you need a number of years before you see an impact. It takes a while to scale these programs up. It takes a while for them to show their impacts. Often, when these studies are done, they're done with a too short a period. The same thing I can say for education impacts, because changes in nutrition is accumulative. Changes in use of healthcare services, like I showed you here, that happens quickly. Changes in the impact of those healthcare services, that takes time. So part of the reason for these the lack of significant results has to do, part of it is a research issue, but it's not all. It's a design issue as well. It has been shown that when the program has focused on younger children, after all, a cash transfer is to the household, but when you focus the resources on households, particularly with very young children or pregnant women, the impact is often greater. It's also important for the duration, for the entire time of a pregnancy and in the first few years of a child's life. If the transfers that entire period, the studies have shown greater impact. But I'm also part of the problem is the services that the people go to are still not very good. One of the most common service that is monitored for CCTs, for conditional cash transfers, is growth monitoring. I showed you that graph. I'll go up and show you the big red bar from Mexico is growth monitoring. Growth monitoring by itself does nothing. If you go there, your child is weighed and height taken, it's put into the computer, next, takes the next child. There's nothing for that family. Unless the growth monitoring has growth promotion, that is counseling that goes to the households and counseling where the people are trained to recognize where is the bottleneck in that household. Growth monitoring, you check off your box and you get your CCT, but you don't get the nutrition service that's designed. That's a common problem. Now, to show you that if you recognize these design features, you can make improvements, Peru recently redesigned its CCT program. Looking at the early results, which were not very impressive, they targeted it to younger children, not 0 to 5, but 0 to 3. And they provided much more training for growth promotion, counseling. And they found significant improvements in the heights. Actually, only the heights of boys. I don't know why that is, by the way. But they used the information on the initial study of their own program as a feedback loop to redesign their program with positive results. I would also say that just any transfer program, if you can link it with behavior change communication to the recipients, not necessarily in the CCT, but you can do it in the CCT, I'm not going to talk about it in length because I believe that it will be discussed by one of my colleagues later on today. But there is evidence on that as well. Finally, adding supplements as part of a program. That is, again, Mexico did this. Not everybody who received the CCT received food supplements, but those children who were most malnourished received, not only the household received its cash, but the child, there were supplements for complementary feeding for that child. So it's a mixture of cash and supplements, and that led to improved nutrition on those individuals who were most at risk. So that is sort of a bridge between a nutrition-sensitive and a nutrition-specific program, and in the case of Mexico, proved to be beneficial. Changing a bit, more general question, is in-kind transfer, is it obsolete? It's clearly out of favor, but is it obsolete? I mean, it's out of favor for good reasons. The ability to transfer cash reliably, so you know who got it when, has improved greatly. In places I've been, and I use this example a lot, camel herders in northern Kenya, the woman takes her camel and a few other things to the local store, takes out a card where her fingerprint and photograph is digitally implanted. It is run through the shopkeeper's machine, solar powered. Message goes to the bank. The bank said, yeah. She gets 2,500 Kenyan shillings, buys food at that store, goes home. If you can do that in northern Kenya for camel herders, you can probably do it anywhere that you try to. How much it costs to set that up? Well, Kenya has a very good IT system, but in general, can be done. And in fact, cash transfers have been used even in the wake of the tsunami in 2005. You would think that cash transfers are hard to set up in an emergency situation, and I think that's probably true on a general basis. But there are cases where cash transfers have been set up in emergency, I guess the tsunami of 2004, but anyhow, set up in emergencies and have been used. So cash transfers are clearly feasible. You'll hear more a little later on, I believe, but IFPRI has done a series of studies on randomized trials, cash versus in-kind transfers in 4 different settings. And the one generalization that comes out of this, which comes out of similar studies elsewhere, is that cash transfers are cheaper. You can save, in the IFPRI study, between 13 and 23% of the cost is saved. Other studies show even greater, because there were no leakage in the randomized trial that IFPRI did. If there's leakage, then the cost is, depending on which has greater leakage, can be cost savings could be even greater. And that's one generalization which I think comes out of almost any comparison of cash and in-kind. Cash saves money, and if it saves money, you can reach more people, or you can reach the same number of people with greater transfers. Cash transfers tend to promote diet diversity because people can choose. I mean, if you only get a bag of grain, you either only consume that, or you go and maybe trade that grain in the market for somebody who wants to get that grain and gives you a little pulses or something. But it's a lot easier with cash. I mean, that's cash versus barter. We all have known that for a long time. Cash gives you greater diet diversity. And I've already mentioned that there's no indication that cash transfers leads to what are called temptation goods. No data on that. But again, context matters. I think all of you are probably aware that just earlier this week, Angus Deaton got a Nobel Prize for economics. Among his many contributions is he's pushed back a little on randomized controlled trials, saying that if it works in one setting and you've measured it perfectly, it does not mean it works in the other setting. Try to understand what are the structural reasons why it worked. Pretty obvious, but not always done. What's the structural reason why cash works as good or better than an in-kind transfer? Has to do with market function, market integration. Where markets function good is different, function well, anyhow, where markets function, it's different than where they don't function. In emergent situations, markets may not be functioning, and there may be a reason why in-kind might be better. If a flood has destroyed all markets, you want to bring grain in, you don't want to just bring cash in. There are cases, depending on the markets. There's a very well-known study where cash and in-kind were trying in a randomized trial in Mexico. These were villages that are so remote, that's very important, so remote that Progressa, the cash transfer of Mexico, couldn't run there. It's too far out. They didn't try to do cash transfers because it's so remote. The experiment went in and did cash versus in-kind and found that when cash came in, food prices went up. There was local inflation. That's because the markets weren't well integrated. Cash put into Niger for grain markets had no impact on prices. Grain moves in Niger, I'm surprised a bit, but grain moved no impact. So again, context matters, and what we're talking about context, in this case, the structural reason you can understand on how well the markets are integrated. You also found in-kind transfers were preferred over cash in Ethiopia, which had a public works that had both in different communities. And the reason for that was inflation. When food prices go up rapidly, your in-kind transfer has the same value. Your cash buys you less food than it did before. In-kind is, by very nature, inflation-proof. You can offset that. You can raise wages, or in the case of Brazil's transfer program, they increased the transfer when prices went up. Trouble with that is you can't always bring them back down when prices drop if it's a food price spike. If it's not just general inflation, but in the case of 2008, was a year-long spike. I don't know what happened afterwards when prices went down, how things were adjusted. But there's other ways that you can deal with a combination of cash and in-kind. I've already mentioned Mexico, where it's generally cash, but there's a little in-kind tailored to children's needs. This again has been tried in emergency response, drought response in Africa, where you have lipid-based, very dense foods, which are very good for children who are weaning. The combination works. And finally, one thing about in-kind transfers, in principle, they can be fortified. I mention here the example of Gujarat, which fortified its PDS. I have learned this morning that that was discontinued because the cost, it was fortified flour, which is more expensive than grain. It's a different service, technically a different product, but because of legal issues that had to be discontinued. Briefly, I'm told I only have 1 minute, I'm gonna go over. School feeding is a type of in-kind conditional transfer. It's conditional on going to school. And it's huge globally. 375 million children, rich countries, poor countries, all over the world. $75 billion a year spent on it. It's big. And it's clear that school feeding increases enrollment, increases school attendance. Its nutritional impacts is less clear for a number of reasons. One is, there are studies that show sometimes it stays with the school child, and other studies show that it's shared among siblings. I think that when it's shared among siblings, it's a better nutrition project because the younger siblings are the ones that are nutritionally at risk. School-aged children are not generally nutritionally at risk, and in fact, there's a problem in many countries. School feeding is used to address obesity. You don't want to increase their calories over what they would be getting at home. You want them to to get more comfortable eating fruits and vegetables. That's a problem in Latin America, and they're using school feeding to address it. But again, school feeding could be a great vehicle for micronutrient fortification, or even a platform for micronutrient supplementation. It's not always done. I don't understand. I really am puzzled by why it doesn't cost much, but it's not always done. Public works is not generally considered nutrition sensitive. The target population are households which are labor surplus. A widow or a female-headed household may not be labor surplus, but you can get around that. You can have creches. Going further, Djibouti has a program where it is targeted primarily to women. A woman has to first attend a behavioral change communication before anybody in the household, male or female, can get the public works program. So it's a combination somewhat of conditional and public works. But the point is that it's been designed. Design elements of the transfer program were put in order to encourage better nutrition. Ethiopia, which has had one of the largest public works programs in the world, very successful for over 10 years, has recently added nutrition design features to its program. So what are the obstacles to doing this? One, some of them I'm puzzled. I don't know why you don't do micronutrients, for example. But part of the problem is just limited resources. Some countries do not have the resources to get a meaningful transfer to every age group, and they have to decide, do you want to do the old age, pension first, and then worry about children? Do you want to do a child program first? Now, some countries like South Africa do both, and they do it well. But South Africa is a middle-income country, has managed it. But sometimes there is that trade-off that have to be considered. And particularly, the poorer the country, the harder it is to decide. You can't reach all the poor with as much of a transfer that's behaviorally meaningful as you would like. Another obstacle is the fact that to make a transfer program nutritionally sensitive often means you have to work across ministries. The school departments have to work with health. The public assistance program has to work with health. That's not always easy. Okay, the conclusion just comes out of the points I've already said. Depends on how much you target, which is your target population. The younger the child, the better, or the pregnant women, better. Behavioral change tied in some way or another to transfer programs is almost certainly going to increase the nutritional impact. If you're tying the transfer to services, make sure that you put attention to quality as well as quantity of services. Again, that's pretty obvious. School feeding, bring your micronutrients in. And in times of crisis, let's particularly try to scale up to address the nutritional shocks. Many studies show that being 2 years old in a year of a drought will have lifelong consequences. Long after the household income has gone up, that 2-year-old will still be stunted. So to be able to scale up the drought. Finally, one other point, which I don't call a conclusion because it's very speculative, but there's evidence that depression affects both nutrition, maternal depression, and the early childhood development, the cognitive development of the child, maternal depression. And if a transfer program can alleviate the stress of a household, it might work to address these more cognitive obstacles that households have. There's studies now on bandwidth and how households make decisions. A transfer program may very well affect decisions just because it relieves the stress on the decision maker. This is speculative. I've not seen research on it, but it seems to be one area that would be profitable to understand better. Thank you.